Okay, so I just had an idea. I was thinking about my reoccurring dream, and then listening to this guy's talk about a hallucination old lady sees. I'm gonna rewind it, but it just popped into my head, like the ones where I have, like I'm going in and out of doors. I'm running into people and they know who I am. It's almost like the same, similar people, like, oh, hey, how are you? But then I go up, like say I walk into their closet door, I go up some more stairs, open another door, I'm in another place, and it just keeps going and going. And then part of that reoccurring dream is also where I've taken along like 3 or 4 of my best friends, or whomever it was. And I said, where do you want to go? You'll never believe this, watch this. And then, so say my sister used to live in California, so we used to just like open another door and then there would be a tube, which I'm trying to remember like what it used to look like before we jumped down. And I think it used to be like black and just as like fiery, beautiful colors as like the rainbow rays of the sun. But anyway, and he's talking, he describes her. So we jumped down the tube and then we ended up wherever we wanted to go. And it was a reoccurring dream, and it's one of my first prints that I made back then. Whew, it was a reductive print. But it just hit me like, so what if that's part of like another dimension? As part of like spirit part. And perhaps... yeah, and this lady's totally blind, and she was seeing people go up and down stairs. I don't know if they're imaginary stairs or what, but it just made me think of my dream popped in, and my head flashed at that moment. Okay, let's see here.
A man who turns towards me. I went in to see her. It was evident straight away that she was perfectly sane and lucid and of good intelligence. But she'd been very startled and very bewildered because she'd been seeing things. And she told me, the nurses hadn't mentioned this, that she was blind. That she had been completely blind from macular degeneration for 5 years, but now, for the last few days, she'd been seeing things. So I said, what sort of things? And she said, people in Eastern dress, in drapes, walking up and down stairs. A man who turns towards me and smiles, but he has huge teeth on one side of his mouth. Animals, too. I see a white building, it's snowing, a soft snow. I see this horse with a harness dragging the snow away. Then one night, the scene changes. I see cats and dogs walking towards me. They come to a certain point and then stop. Then it changes again. I see a lot of children. They're walking up and down stairs. They wear bright colors, rose and blue, like Eastern dress. Sometimes, she said, before the people come on, she may hallucinate pink and blue squares on the floor, which seem to go up to the ceiling.
Wow.
So I said, is this like a dream? And she said, no, it's not like a dream. It's like a movie. She said it's got color, it's got motion, but it's completely silent, like a silent movie. And she said, and it's a rather boring movie. She said, all these people with Eastern dress, walking up and down, very, very repetitive, very limited. And she had a sense of humor. She knew it was a hallucination, but she was frightened. She'd lived 95 years and she'd never had a hallucination before. She said that the hallucinations were unrelated to anything she was thinking or feeling or doing, that they seemed to come on by themselves or disappear. She had no control over them. She said she didn't recognize any of the people or places in the hallucinations, and none of the people or the animals, well, they all seemed oblivious of her. And she didn't know what was going on. She wondered if she was going mad or losing her mind. Well, I examined her carefully. She was a bright old lady, perfectly sane. She had no medical problems. She wasn't on any medications which could produce hallucinations, but she was blind. And I then said to her, I think I know what you have. I said, there is a special form of visual hallucination which may go with deteriorating vision or blindness. This was originally described, I said, right back in the 18th century by a man called Charles Bonnet, and you have Charles Bonnet syndrome. There's nothing wrong with your brain. There's nothing wrong with your mind. You have Charles Bonnet syndrome. And she was very relieved at this, that there was nothing seriously the matter, and also rather curious. She said, who is this Charles Bonnet? She said, did he have them himself? And she said, tell all the nurses that I have Charles Bonnet syndrome. I'm not crazy, I'm not demented, I have Charles Bonnet syndrome. Well, so I did tell the nurses. Now, this for me is a common situation. I work in old age homes largely. I see a lot of elderly people who are hearing impaired or visually impaired. About 10% of the hearing impaired people get musical hallucinations. And about 10% of the visually impaired people get visual hallucinations. You don't have to be completely blind, only sufficiently impaired. Now, with the original description in the 18th century, Charles Bonnet did not have them. His grandfather had these hallucinations. His grandfather was a magistrate, an elderly man. He'd had cataract surgery. His vision was pretty poor. And in 1759, he described to his grandson various things he was seeing. The first thing he said was he saw a handkerchief in midair. It was a large blue handkerchief with 4 orange circles, and he knew it was a hallucination. You don't have handkerchiefs in midair. And then he saw a big wheel in midair. But sometimes he wasn't sure whether he was hallucinating or not, because the hallucinations would fit in the context of the visions. So on one occasion, when his granddaughters were visiting him, he said, "And who are these handsome young men with you?" And they said, "Alas, Grandpapa, there are no handsome young men." And then the handsome young men disappeared. It's typical of these hallucinations that they may come in a flash and disappear in a flash. They don't usually fade in and out. They're rather sudden, and they change suddenly. Charles Lulin, the grandfather, saw hundreds of different figures, different landscapes of all sorts. On one occasion, he saw a man in a bathrobe smoking a pipe and realized it was himself. That was the only figure he recognized. On one occasion, when he was walking the streets of Paris, he saw, this was real, a scaffolding, but when he got back home, he saw a miniature of the scaffolding, 6 inches high, on his study table. This repetition of perception is sometimes called palinopsia. Well, with him and with Rosalie, what seems to be going on, and Rosalie said what's going on, and I said that as you lose vision, as the visual parts of the brain are no longer getting any input, they become hyperactive and excitable, and they start to fire spontaneously, and you start to see things. The things you see can be very complicated indeed. With another patient of mine who also had some vision, the vision she had could be disturbing. On one occasion, she said she saw a man in a striped shirt in a restaurant, and he turned round, and then he divided into 6 figures in striped shirts who started walking towards her, and then the 6 figures came together like a concertina. Once, when she was driving, or rather her husband was driving, who would divide it into
I'm fucking with the speaker now.
up 4 roads. She had very mobile.
I swear I feel when my speaker goes all weird from the Wi-Fi, knowing maybe there's a break in the frequency. I'm trying to key in to tell if I can feel what it feels like. Weird.
Hallucinations as well. A lot of them had to do with a car. Sometimes she would see a teenage boy sitting on the hood of the car. He was very tenacious, and he moved rather gracefully when the car turned. And then when they came to a stop, the boy would do a sudden vertical takeoff 100 foot in the air and then disappear. Another patient of mine had a different sort of hallucination. This was a woman who didn't have trouble with her eyes, but the visual parts of her brain, a little tumor in the occipital cortex. And above all, she would see cartoons. And these cartoons would be transparent and would cover half the visual field like a screen. And especially she saw cartoons of Kermit the Frog. Now, I don't watch Sesame Street, but she made a point of saying, why Kermit? She said, Kermit the Frog means nothing to me. You know, I was wondering about Freudian determinants, why Kermit? Kermit the Frog means nothing to me. She didn't mind the cartoons too much, but what did disturb her was she got very persistent images or hallucinations of faces. And as with Rosalie, the faces were often deformed with very large teeth or very large eyes. And these frightened her. Well, what is going on with these people? As a physician, I have to try and define what's going on and to reassure people, especially to reassure them that they're not going insane. Something like 10%, as I said, of visually impaired people get these, but no more than 1% of the people acknowledge them because they're afraid they will be seen as insane or something. And if they do mention them to their own doctors, they may be misdiagnosed. In particular, the notion is that if you see things or hear things, you're going mad. But the psychotic hallucinations are quite different. Psychotic hallucinations, whether they're visual or vocal, they address you, they accuse you, they seduce you, they humiliate you, they jeer at you. You interact with them. There is none of this quality of being addressed with these Charles Bonnet hallucinations. There is a film. You're seeing a film which had nothing to do with you. Well, that's how people think about it. There's also a rare thing called temporal lobe epilepsy, and sometimes if one has this, one may feel oneself transported back to a time and place in the past. You're at a particular road junction, you smell chestnuts roasting, you hear the traffic, all the senses were involved, and you're waiting for your girl. And it's that Tuesday evening back in 1982. The temporal lobe hallucinations are all sense hallucinations, full of feeling, full of familiarity, located in space and time, coherent, dramatic. The Charles Bonnet ones are quite different. So in the Charles Bonnet hallucinations, you have all sorts of level, from the geometrical hallucinations, the pink and blue squares the woman had, up to quite elaborate hallucinations with figures and especially faces. Faces, and sometimes deformed faces, are the single commonest thing in these hallucinations. And one of the second commonest is cartoons.
What if it's not hallucinations? What if it's some form of technology, ether, connection? I don't know, because what if it is this is in relation to why I see so much in the clouds? You know, like, I mean, I can look at a tree and I don't see a whole lot of faces in them. I can look at dirt. Sometimes it takes me a while to like see something in the dirt or whatever, but these faces, I swear, they're there, or they're a reflection of somebody from somewhere. Or I don't know.
So what is going on? Fascinatingly, in the last few years, it's been possible to do functional brain imagery, to do fMRI on people as they are hallucinating.
Whoa.
And in fact, to find that different parts of the visual brain are activated as they are hallucinating. When people have these simple geometrical hallucinations, the primary visual cortex is activated. This is the part of the brain which perceives edges and patterns. You don't form images with your primary visual cortex. When images are formed, a higher part of the visual cortex is involved in the temporal lobe. And in particular, one area of the temporal lobe is called the fusiform gyrus. And it's known that if people have damage in the fusiform gyrus, they may lose the ability to recognize faces. But if there's an abnormal activity in the fusiform gyrus, they may hallucinate faces. And this is exactly what you find in some of these people. There's an area in the anterior part of this gyrus where teeth and eyes are represented. And that part of the gyrus is activated when people get the deformed hallucinations. There is another part of the brain which is especially activated when one sees cartoons. It's activated when one recognizes cartoons, when one draws cartoons, and when one hallucinates them. It's very interesting that that should be specific. There are other parts of the brain which are specifically involved with the recognition and hallucination of buildings and landscapes. And around 1970, it was found that there were not only parts of the brain, but particular cells, face cells, were discovered around 1970. And now we know that there are hundreds of other sorts of cells which can be very, very specific. So you may not only have car cells, you may have Aston Martin cells. I saw an Aston Martin this morning. I had to bring it in. and now it's in there somewhere. So now at this level, in what's called the infratemporal cortex, there are only visual images or figments or fragments. It's only at higher levels that the perception. So you're in these levels of inferior visual cortex where you have found. And in the Charles Bonnet syndrome, you don't go to those higher levels. You're in these levels of inferior visual cortex where you have thousands and tens of thousands and millions of images or figments or fragmentary figments, all neurally encoded in particular cells or small clusters of cells. Normally, these are all part of the integrated stream of perception or imagination, and one is not conscious of them. It is only if one is visually impaired or blind that the process is interrupted. And instead of getting normal perception, you are getting an anarchic, convulsive stimulation or release of all of these visual cells in the infratemporal cortex. So suddenly you see a face, suddenly you see a car, suddenly this, and suddenly that. The mind does its best to organize and to give some sort of coherence to this, but not terribly successfully. When these were first described, it was thought that they could be interpreted like dreams, but in fact people say, I don't recognize the people, I can't form any associations, Kermit means nothing to me. You don't get anywhere thinking of them as dreams. Well, I've more or less said what I wanted. I think I just want to recapitulate and say this is common. Think of the number of blind people. There must be hundreds of thousands of blind people who have these hallucinations but are too scared to mention them. So this sort of thing needs to be brought into notice for patients, for doctors, for the public. Finally, I think they are infinitely interesting and valuable for giving one some insight as to how the brain works. Charles Bonnet said 250 years ago, he wondered how, thinking of these hallucinations, how, as he put it, the theater of the mind could be generated by the machinery of the brain. Now, 250 years later, I think we're beginning to glimpse how this is done. Thanks very much.
That was superb. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you.
You speak about these things with so much insight and empathy for your patients. I mean, have you yourself experienced any of the syndromes you write about?
I was afraid you would ask that. Yeah, a lot of them. And actually, I'm a little visually impaired myself. I'm blind in one eye and not terribly good in the other. And I see the geometrical hallucinations, but they stop there.
And they don't disturb you? Because you understand what's doing it, it doesn't make you worry?
Well, they don't disturb me any more than my tinnitus, which I ignore. They occasionally interest me. I have many pictures of them in my notebooks. I've gone and had an fMRI myself to see how my visual cortex is ticking over. And when I see all these hexagons and complex things, which I also have in visual migraine, I wonder whether everyone sees things like this and whether things like cave art or ornamental art may have been derived from them a bit.
That was an utterly, utterly fascinating talk. Thank you so much for sharing.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Hello there. Our topic for today is the basis of zodiac signs, Hellenistic bounds, and sign rulers in prime numbers. And what I'm going to suggest to you today is that prime numbers have a strong relationship to the existence of zodiac signs, to the ruling planets of the signs, and also to an idea that was used in ancient Western astrology known as the bounds. In the ancient Hellenistic form of astrology, they're often referred to as bounds, and in the later medieval tradition, they're often referred to as terms. The same thing. So this is an amazing concept and a new idea that there appear to be very strong relationships between prime numbers and things like zodiac signs, Hellenistic bounds, and sign rulers. Excuse me. Now, a little background to this. The complex rules of astrology were invented or discovered. They were put together, whatever you want to call it. Historians believe it was somewhere in the range of 700 to 200 BC, somewhere roughly in that time area. It may have been mostly over a few hundred years. The complex rules of astrology were developed. Before that, there was astrology, but without as complex and intricate rules. Now, some of the rules of astrology that were developed are simple and elegant, such as the elements and the modes. I've got a typo there. It says modes of the signs. In other words, the cardinal, fixed, mutable, the fire, earth, air, water. If you're a student of astrology, you're very familiar with this. And it's nice and simple. You start with the first sign, Aries, and you go right around. And it's a nice, simple, organized system. Now, there are other ideas that have been passed down in the ancient tradition and apparently developed somewhere in that first millennium BC, which are a little more odd. They're kind of peculiar. They seem rather arbitrary. Examples of these would be the bounds and why the fixed signs are used as the basis for sign rulerships. So here are the sign rulerships. As most of you know, the sun is the ruler of Leo. Mercury rules Virgo. Venus rules Libra. And many people now are aware that there's a symmetry here. If we start at 0 Leo and go around this way, we have Sun, Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, Saturn, and going the opposite way, we have the same exact thing, except we have the Sun and Moon paired together, and then the same planets in the same order. Now, so there are two things going on here. One is there's a symmetry at 0 Leo, and there's also an interesting thing at 0 Scorpio, this fixed sign cross at the beginning of the fixed signs. What's happening on this side, the Scorpio to Aries side, are the planets that move independently of the sun and moon. Or let's say they move far away from the sun and moon. Remember that ancient astrology was visual. People just looked out at the sky, and you see these three stars that can wander all around the sky, completely separate from the sun: Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn. Mercury and Venus are tied together. It's as if they're on a leash. They're tethered to the sun. They stay, Venus within about 47, 48 degrees of the sun, Mercury within about 27, 28 degrees. They stay close to the sun. And then the moon is like a sun that you see at night. The sun and moon are the same size. They're much larger. So you have the two lights the sun and moon as they're often referred to, and the two planets that are attached, held on a leash to the sun, and then the three independent ones on the other side. So we have the solar lunar family here, and we have the outer, more distant, free roaming, wandering stars here. So there's two interesting things here: the symmetry around the 0 Leo, 0 Aquarius, and then this division of the kinds of wandering objects there are out there from the ancient point of view, separating the Scorpio to Aries. What's very peculiar about this whole arrangement is why the fixed signs are used. It's almost as if it's off balance. The Aries, the cardinal signs seem like the more natural starting point, but the thing is tilted to the fixed signs. As we'll see, this makes sense in terms of prime numbers as we proceed with this lecture today. Now, here are the bounds. They're even more bizarre. This is an idea that was used in Hellenistic and medieval astrology, that each sign is divided into 5 pieces, but the 5 pieces are not equal. So Aries 0 to 6 is a Jupiter area, but Taurus 0 to 8 is a Venus area. And the general tendency, if you look at this long enough, is you'll notice the benefics tend to be towards the beginning of the 5 sections within each sign, and the last 2 signs tend to be the malefics, Mars and Saturn. The last bound, we call these the bounds. The 5th bound is always malefic. The 4th bound is often malefic. And then it gets kind of mixed up, and we're getting malefics thrown even into the 1st bound. So, there's a very rough and crude tendency for the malefics to be towards the end, always at the very end. But it's still unclear where they come up with these ideas. It looks bizarre. Did they just dream this up? Did an extraterrestrial, land and tell them this? It's kind of wild. What we're going to see is that the prime numbers fit this pattern, at least to some extent. Rather extraordinary. By the way, this table of the bounds according to the Ptolemaic system, this is taken from astrologer Lee Lehman's website. There's the website address. I just copied it and pasted it in there. Lee has all kinds of great information on her website. Okay, now, so in this time period, 700 to 200 BC, somewhere around there, the complex rules of astrology are invented. What else is going on at that time? Well, mathematics is a big deal. It's very important, sometimes considered to have defined qualities. We have Pythagoras somewhere around the 500 BCs, Euclid somewhere around the 300 BCs. Some of the mathematics is public. Some of it is private and protected. The Pythagoreans were known for it's almost like a religion and secret information that was held by them. So mathematics holds a high place. So could mathematics have influenced the development of astrological ideas more than we realize? It would seem like they could. I mean, these are two hot topics of the time: the development of astrology, the development of mathematics. And what we're going to find out here is that prime numbers appear to be a basis for some of the seemingly arbitrary ideas that were developed. 3 exclamation points. Some of the properties of prime numbers coincide with astrological ideas. So this is something I've noticed. I haven't seen it referenced elsewhere, but it's something playing around with this that I've noticed. And it looks like it's too much of a coincidence. So we don't have any primary historical sources, at least I'm not aware of, that state that prime numbers are the basis of these ideas. But there are some very curious coincidences, a lot of them, and we're going to look at that. All right, so to understand this, let's get a feeling for prime numbers. Number 1, I've got 3 sections on this slide. The first slide is if you take your numbers and just start counting, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, with the even numbers on the right and the odd numbers on the left. Well, even numbers are not prime. You can consider the number 2 to be prime, but after that, they're not prime numbers. 2, 4, 6, 8, 10. Obviously, they're not. They're multiples of 2. So this is obvious. You can go through and put all the numbers there, and all the even numbers are non-prime, other than the first one, number 2, and some of the odd numbers are prime. Okay, no big deal, but it is a big deal in the sense that we immediately eliminate half of the integers up to infinity as knowing that they're not prime by doing this. Now, we can also remove multiples of 3. 3, 6, 9, 12, 15. This is a well-known procedure going all the way back to Hellenistic Greece, where people did this, called the sieve of Eratosthenes. And an interesting thing is if you count 6 at a time, which in other words is 2 times 3, these colored numbers, I've got a mistake here, the 8 should be red. This is a red, this is red, these are the multiples, these are the even numbers, and the 3 and the 6 are this 3, 9, 15, 6, 12, 18. Well, the 6, 12, 18 is both multiple of 3 and 6. So you have your multiples of 3 and multiples of 2, multiples of 2, multiples of 2, multiples of 3. So the prime numbers, the bottom line is the prime numbers are in this column where you start with 1 and you add 6, 1, 7, 13, we add 6, we get 19, or 5, 11, 17. All prime numbers exist within these 2 columns. And interestingly, these 2 columns are equidistant from this midpoint of 3, 9, 15. It's just an observation. Well, I suspect, I'm proposing that the ancients noticed this and they related it to astrology, as we'll see in a minute. First of all, how many of these sections of 6, this is like a rhythm of 6. Prime numbers have a rhythm of 6, where all prime numbers are within these 2 columns, and these 2 columns occur in groups of 6. Well, there are 5, the same number as the bounds. So this grouping of numbers, I think, gets connected to the idea of the bounds, which I'll explain in more detail soon. Now, just to make this clear, not all numbers in this column are prime, but there are no numbers that are outside either this column or this column that are prime. Now, we can go one more level, and this is where the astrology really starts to kick in, and this becomes interesting, is that if we do 2 times 3 times 5, we get 30. And if we arrange the prime numbers, now I know this is small, but I hope you can read it. If we start counting from 1 to say 90, I stopped after 3 rows of numbers, the numbers that could be prime fall only in these columns. You start with 1 and you keep adding 30. You start with 7, you keep adding 30. You start with 11, keep adding 30. Similarly, you start with 17, 19, 23, or 29, and you keep adding 30, and all prime numbers up to infinity are in these columns and nowhere else. These others, the red, blue, and green, are multiples of 2, 3, and 5. So it's a very, very simple idea, but the fact it's simple does not mean it wasn't important. And again, it's symmetric. Very curiously, it's symmetric around the middle of what we can call the zodiac signs. So in the sign of Aries, 1, 7, 11, 13, 17, 19, 23, and 29 might be prime. In the sign of Taurus, 31, which in other words is 1 degree Taurus, 7, 11, 13, 17, 19, 23, and 29, same degrees, might be prime. 49 is not prime. So many of these are prime, but not all of them. And I believe, as we'll see in the next slide, that when it's not prime, it means it's a strange area. It's not built on the basic 2, 3, and 5. It's built on a 7 or an 11. It's not built on the basic 30 system. So the number 49 is weird. So I believe what the ancients thought is when they saw this 49, they said there's a different vibration than the normal 30, than the 2, 3, and 5. That's the basis of the zodiac. We brought in a different quality. Same thing happens at 77, which is 11 times 7. So my theory is that the ancients might have noticed this pattern, related it to the zodiac, and where a prime number does not exist where we might expect it, such as the 49 and the 77, those become interesting degree areas that bring in a flavor other than the normal 2, 3, and 5. So the black numbers that are in these columns that are equidistant from the middle of the zodiac sign. You take the middle of the zodiac sign, you go back 2, 4, 8, or 14, and that's where all your prime numbers are. These black numbers, excuse me, that are equidistant from the
I don't know what that means. Like, what was it for?
is if there's the right at the beginning.
Ow, and I'm
They're
getting
for
crazy pains in my side.
Normally, the beginning is bounds again. Well, let me go back up to that table. The beginning be benefic, and the end is malefic. So it's the